For years, we were told the digital economy was clean, weightless, frictionless. It was all just code floating around the cloud. But here's the thing. There is no cloud. There are just buildings, massive buildings connected to almost unimaginable demand for water, electricity, and land. And the development of these buildings has taken center stage in fights over democracy happening all over this country. But this is not a new story. This is an old American story. It is the story of extraction. I'm Stuart Day, and this is Exposure Points. Before we dive into today's episode on data centers, a quick reminder. Exposure exists because of viewers like you. If you like this kind of journalism, please share, like, and comment. Visit exposurestudios.org for more information and to watch more episodes. When most people hear the phrase data center, they picture something like a warehouse building full of blinking lights. But the hyperscale facilities being proposed right now are much closer to industrial utility infrastructure than warehouse space. There are already thousands of data centers operating across the United States, with thousands more at various stages of development. The newest AI campuses are reaching scales that just a few years ago would have sounded almost cartoonishly absurd. Kevin O'Leary's proposed AI project in Utah has a reported scope of roughly 40,000 acres. That's more than twice the size of Manhattan. And Meta's proposed Hyperion campus in Louisiana may ultimately require the equivalent output of roughly 10 natural gas power plants, according to some reports. Think about that. Not 10 power plants serving a region or a city, but 10 power plants worth of electricity demand tied to one single-use commercial campus. To give you some perspective, a single gigawatt of energy can power roughly 800,000 homes annually. Many of the hyperscale facilities being proposed or built right now are multiple gigawatt facilities. That's why size matters with industrial development. This is not like building an office building. These projects require substations, utility transmission upgrades, enormous backup generation, big water withdrawals, roads, security infrastructure, massive concrete and steel construction. We need to stop visualizing these as big warehouses or office buildings. We have never built anything this large, this fast before. In terms of land use, energy demand, and infrastructure, it's almost like building an entire small city from scratch and plugging that demand directly into society overnight. And once you frame it that way, the questions become obvious. Where does the electricity come from? Where does the water come from? Who pays for the infrastructure upgrades? How many permanent jobs are actually created? What happens to the ratepayer? What happens to the surrounding landscape? What happens to the farmers and the local economies? What are the impacts to the environment, public health, and the communities that these land on? How much consent and power should a community have in the face of projects that are on a scale the likes of which we've never seen before? Some of the most powerful voices pushing this build-out are normalizing the dismissal of these questions and the people asking them. Communities raising questions about water, land, energy, public subsidies, local control are being framed as irrational, anti-progress, anti-technology, or standing in the way of the future. They're being dismissed as paid agitators or out of touch with reality. But these are not anti-technology questions. These are literally some of the most basic questions any sane society would be asking about developments of this scale with this level of potential impact. One of the things that has bothered me about this all along is the growing expectation that people should simply accept these massive projects without asking difficult questions. Small cities are effectively being built inside communities overnight around a technology that many people already feel is deeply disruptive to human life, including those who have designed it. Increasingly, political and corporate leaders seem less interested in persuading the public than in declaring this future inevitable. The message increasingly feels like this is happening, get comfortable with it, stop asking so many questions. And I don't think any healthy democratic society should ever be comfortable with that. With us to talk a little bit more about this is Kare Faridun with the Better Path Coalition. She's been on top of this issue in Pennsylvania and talking to a lot of people all over the state. Welcome to Exposure Points, Karen. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for the invitation, Stuart. Happy to be here.
You just helped to host a virtual town hall on data centers. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so we've been frustrated, frankly, that people feel very blindsided by the coming of all these data centers. They don't feel that the state has ever made the case for the need to have these data centers, especially with this kind of rush when so little is really known about them in terms of like academic research. But a lot of people in places like Virginia have amazing testimonials to share about how impacted they have been. So, why do we have to leap before we look? Always. Why can't we take the time to see if we need to do this at all, where they should go, how they should be regulated? We just, we are inclined to always take a hard-nosed stance on things. But in this case, they didn't even bother trying to tell us why we should support them. And so we were frustrated that people were left out of the decision-making process, that they were never asked if they wanted these things in their communities. And we were pressing on the governor to, as the person who probably heads the state government in a way that even legislators don't, who can go out into their districts and do town halls. The governor is the one person who could do something statewide. And he didn't. And we were pressing on him to do something. And then we, at the beginning of the year, we decided that we would host the town hall, but we would try to work with the governor's office. And so we reached out and we said, we'd like to do this town hall. And they wrote back and said, sorry, he's not available. And then we said, well, we didn't give you a date. So how can you tell us, he's not available? And so we wrote back and said, okay, here's every date in the month of March, pick one. And they said, he's not available. So we decided to schedule one ourselves, tell him when it was going to be, and then really pressure him to attend. And so we selected May 13th, and that gave us, a little bit more than a month to organize. And we, had thousands and thousands of people signing a giant invitation. We took a 4-foot engraved invitation to Harrisburg to his office that had 3 posters along with it that contained even more signatures because we ran out of space. We had 74 organizations represented there, not just the individuals. And then we had people doing a call-in day, and people were calling his office anyhow. And we had people submit meeting requests, which, is one of the steps you have to take. So we said, everybody do one. And so lots of people were submitting meeting requests, inviting him to come. And he just ignored all of it.
So let's talk a bit about the history of this, because it certainly didn't start with ChatGPT. If we zoom out, the roots of modern computing infrastructure go back to World War II, when governments built early systems like the code-breaking machines at Bletchley Park. Even then, the pattern was familiar: centralization around power, scale, and control. During the Cold War, large-scale computing remained deeply tied to military intelligence and surveillance systems. What changed later was not necessarily the underlying structure, but the public experience of the technology. As computing moved into the private sector, we were sold an idea that technology and the internet would decentralize power, it would democratize information, it would weaken gatekeeping, and create opportunities. For a while, parts of that have genuinely felt true. Each wave of technology, personal computers, early websites, smartphones, social media, online video, created periods where opportunity did feel more decentralized. Ordinary people could suddenly build businesses, create audiences, distribute media, communicate globally, and participate in the economy in ways that had previously been much harder or outright impossible, even while the infrastructure underneath remained quite centralized around capital-intensive technology. But those windows of decentralization were always somewhat temporary. Platforms consolidate, control tightens, and much of the economic value generated by the digital economy has a tendency to flow back towards a relatively small number of increasingly dominant corporations. But I think there are 2 reasons that the AI moment feels different. The first is that earlier digital waves often still felt additive and deeply human in nature. A kid in rural Iowa who felt isolated could suddenly find people like him somewhere else in the world. Artists could reach audiences without traditional gatekeepers. Small businesses could suddenly reach global markets cheaply on their own. And even when those systems eventually reconcentrated power, many people still experience the technology itself as expanding human connection, participation, creativity, and opportunity. AI increasingly feels different because much of its value proposition is not centered around human connection, to other humans, but around automating and simulating and compressing, replacing things that human beings are very connected to. Writing, creating, researching, communication, coding, even companionship itself. That changes the emotional equation in a profound way. The second reason this moment feels different is the relationship between AI and institutional power. Earlier internet eras were certainly dominated by corporations and capital, but they were still largely framed publicly around consumer empowerment, communication, entertainment, and access. With AI, the relationship to state power, surveillance, military capabilities, intelligence systems, and geopolitical competition feels much more explicit right from the beginning. And where earlier waves of digital advancement often had these temporary windows that felt genuinely decentralized, AI never really had that same feeling. From the very beginning, AI has felt highly managed, highly centralized, and deeply tied to questions about who controls the system, who trains them, whose values and biases shape them, and how they may ultimately be used by institutions of power. We can talk about the good and the bad of it, but there is definitely a major difference between an algorithm curating content for your social media feed and an increasingly powerful artificial intelligence system capable of literally shaping reality for you. And I think a lot of us instinctively feel this shift. Now, the concentration of power that is attached to these systems is exploding. Immense data centers, massive energy demands, gigantic capital concentration, hyperscale computing infrastructure. Unlike previous digital eras, communities are now being asked to absorb the physical consequences of that expansion in ways becoming impossible to ignore. Every part of that digital expansion manifests somewhere as a physical footprint. And with this exponential leap forward with artificial intelligence, we are being asked to confront an equal exponential leap in the physical development. As communities and leaders struggle to understand the implications of all of this, the industry is moving forward with extraordinary speed and urgency. But the real question is whether the risks and burdens being placed on the public and the communities hosting these projects are actually proportional to the benefits. With previous waves of technology, many people felt the answer was yes. Maybe that had to do with the fact that they weren't confronted with the physical footprint of those earlier stages of technology. But maybe the exponential scaling of it all is making us feel much less certain about the risk-reward ratio. So when ChatGPT launched publicly in late 2022, most coverage focused on the novelty of it. Wow, it writes, it answers questions, it feels human. It can search through dozens of websites or articles in seconds and make sense of it. The vast majority of public discourse and debate since then has been dominated by intangible issues like job displacement and how it'll impact things like art and human creativity, how to use it to make money, and the ethics of using it for things like research or writing within institutional settings. All important and serious conversations. But what's been missing from our conversation, at least until very recently, is questions about the physical limitations and consequences. Because generative AI is not just another app. It requires enormous computational power to train models and then enormous ongoing computing power to run them at scale, storing and processing vast amounts of data across massive server infrastructure. What to users feels like a sophisticated piece of software on their phone or computer is actually powered by an enormous amount of physical infrastructure somewhere else. Everything that exists in the digital world is anchored to something in the physical world. When processing power scales up in the cloud, resource demand scales up on the ground: electricity, water, land, infrastructure. That conversation is incredibly urgent because that's where the cost and the burden to society actually shows up. No matter how futuristic the pitch sounds, the build-out lands somewhere. Somebody's land, somebody's watershed, somebody's roads, and somebody's school district. And when you strip away the futuristic branding and the abstraction, what you have is exactly what you always have. You've got land being cleared, bulldozers, diesel, steel, concrete. I talk a lot about how disconnected people have become from the food system and how that disconnect enables many of the problems we now see in agriculture and public health. But that separation from the physical realities of food didn't happen naturally. It was conditioned over generations. For most of human history, survival was directly tied to land, water, weather, and food production. People understood those systems instinctively because they lived inside them. Even in modern society, there's still something deeply visceral and intuitive about food. Most people can emotionally grasp the importance of clean water or healthy soil. That connection can be weakened, but it never fully disappears because it's been part of us for 300,000 years. The AI and data center issue is different. There's nothing instinctive about server infrastructure or hyperscale computing or cloud architecture. Most people have no natural reference point for what AI is doing, how its data is being harvested and stored, and the average person can't really wrap their minds around what a 40,000 acre industrial development project looks like. And that disconnect creates a really dangerous kind of invisibility, because when the public cannot easily visualize the physical reality, it becomes much easier for enormous industrial systems to expand without meaningful scrutiny. Decisions get made behind closed doors and NDAs become normalized. Resource use becomes abstract. The true scale impact can disappear. And that's one of the most important parts of this whole story, is that this industry has been built from day one on a level of abstraction that prevents most people from fully seeing or emotionally connecting to the real world consequences of what's being built. If you've spent time watching industries like oil and gas, petrochemicals, plastics, a lot of this starts to feel very familiar. Environmental and community advocates will often refer to the industry playbook. There isn't a literal handbook, but certain patterns repeat so consistently across industries that it starts to feel like everyone is working from the same playbook. First, they target communities with weak planning frameworks, limited legal resources, inexpensive land, or long histories of economic blight. More often, this is either industrial corridors with large minority populations, or it's remote farm country. Before the public is even aware discussions are happening, developers begin private outreach with landowners, economic development groups, utilities, attorneys, planners, and local officials. This creates a democratic imbalance, because by the time the general public finally hears about the project, relationships have been made, expectations have been set, political momentum is already moving, and local officials start to view the project as their project. Then comes the promises: jobs, growth, tax revenues, community investments. And to be fair, some of these projects do create real economic benefit. That's not really the argument. But the public is often operating, by the time they find out something's happening, they're often operating from a major deficit in time and information. And unless commitments and promises are written into enforceable agreements, many of them are just projections or public relation messaging. Then, as parts of the public start to ask more questions and push back on claims and doubt whether the project is good for the community, that's when the urgency starts. Officials are told delays could cost the community this opportunity. Competing communities are moving faster. Decisions must happen quickly. The idea of big lawsuits starts to get casually dropped into conversations or town hall meetings. Very quickly, the conversation shifts from "should we do this?" to "how fast can we approve this?" When you work on issues like this and you do right-to-know requests and you kind of see this play out in different communities on different projects, is you start to learn that companies and developers can spend months or years building relationships with officials, while ordinary citizens and residents are often given 3 minutes at a public hearing. And after years of watching these fights play out, the single most common thing I hear is people feel like their voices do not matter. And I'm going to tell you personally, I've been cut off at the 3-minute mark many times, and I've seen many others get cut off. And it used to annoy me. But then when I started doing this work and I started reading through right-to-know requests, it started to hit differently. It really gets under my skin, and it should get under your skin, that public officials have no problem spending all this time talking to developers. And they just will not give their own residents any time to talk through these issues and ask these questions. And the thing is that they're not getting cut off because they aren't engaged. In many cases, they are. They're showing up, they're organizing, they're filing the record requests, they're attending hearings, they're learning about zoning laws and trying to participate in good faith. They're doing what we've all been told we're supposed to do, like participate in civics. But many feel dismissed, ignored, and treated like obstacles simply for asking questions. This process is largely hidden from the general public. In fact, exposing it is one of my personal missions with Exposure because it happens constantly across this country and exactly how extractive industries have been so effective over the last 100 years. This is why we are seeing so many packed town hall meetings where huge crowds of residents beg officials to reject a project only to watch it get approved unanimously anyway. The process pits neighbors against each other, gradually aligns local leadership with industry rather than the community, and inverts the civic relationship between citizens and the representatives.
If we can learn, we all want clean water. Nobody wants to give their kid, contaminated water to drink. Nobody wants to, deprive their kids of a healthy environment. We have a constitutional right to it in Pennsylvania. And so if we can get past all of our ideological differences and work together, we are defeating them at their own game because their job is to divide us and keep us divided. And so I think that has actually been pretty persuasive, especially with this data center fight, because it just does cross lines in a way I have not seen another issue cross ideological lines where people are just saying, no, we don't like this, and we'll work with whoever we need to.
Our political leaders are supposed to act as skeptical negotiators, working on behalf of the public, but too often they become cheerleaders or salesmen for the project itself. Once that happens, many people stop feeling represented at all. Honestly, I think this dynamic is one of the core reasons so many people have lost trust in government, not primarily because of politics at the national level, but because of these local and regional situations where communities feel like major decisions have already been made before they even understand what's happening. It makes people feel less like participants in a democratic process and more like passengers being informed where the train is already headed. That is not healthy for a democratic society. A functioning democracy depends on people believing that their voice matters, their concerns are heard, and major decisions are shaped with them rather than simply imposed onto them after the fact. To really understand what's happening here, you have to understand the energy side of this, because the scale is almost difficult to comprehend. The International Energy Agency projects that global electricity demand from data centers could more than double by 2030, driven largely by AI. In the United States, utility companies across multiple states are now warning about load growth unlike anything that they've seen in decades. Grid operators and utilities across the country, PJM in the Mid-Atlantic, Dominion Energy in Virginia, and Georgia Power, have all publicly warned that electricity demand tied to data centers and AI infrastructure is rising far faster than we can build out and far faster than previously estimated. Utilities in states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Texas, Arizona, Utah, and Louisiana are now planning around massive new hyperscale loads. And the reason is simple. AI requires staggering amounts of power for computation. Training large language models can involve thousands to tens of thousands of advanced GPUs running continuously for weeks or months at a time. Then once the models are trained, inference, meaning every question, image generation request, search, or interaction that users make, requires additional ongoing computation at scale. These facilities need extremely stable 24-hour electricity. Downtime is enormously expensive. That means companies are not just looking for power, they're looking for reliable baseload power. That changes the conversation around energy entirely. For years, we were sold the idea that the digital economy was somehow cleaner, lighter, and less physically demanding than traditional industry. Many of the same companies now driving the AI boom also spent years branding themselves around a cleaner, lower carbon digital future through sustainability messaging, ESG commitments, renewable energy credits, carbon offsets, and net zero pledges. But the physical reality behind hyperscale AI is colliding hard with that narrative. These systems require staggering amounts of constant, reliable electricity, and much of the infrastructure currently capable of supporting that demand still depends heavily on natural gas, nuclear power, massive transmission expansion, centralized grid infrastructure, and large backup generation systems, which are usually gas or diesel. That is why we are now watching a major political shift happen in real time. Many of the same politicians and institutions that spent years talking about decarbonization and retiring fossil fuel infrastructure are now supporting massive new expansions of energy infrastructure to power hyperscale AI growth. The branding says cloud, but the physics say traditional grid. I don't want to get too lost in the weeds on the convoluted world of renewable energy accounting mechanisms, but there are some things that you should know. A lot of these companies market hyperscale AI and data centers as helping fund the green energy transition because they purchase enormous amounts of renewable power through credits, offsets, and long-term power purchase agreements. And to be fair, some of that does help finance renewable development. But it's also kind of a sleight of hand because the way this often gets marketed publicly can be very misleading. Most of these companies are not literally powering these facilities in real time with dedicated solar farms or wind farms that they built themselves. What is often happening instead is that they purchase renewable energy credits or offsets or long-term power agreements that allow them to claim large amounts of green energy usage on paper. Those arrangements can carry major branding, financial, political, or regulatory advantages. The company gets to publicly market itself as sustainable or carbon neutral. Investors and ESGs view the project more favorably. Politicians can present the development as part of a green energy solution or transition. But physically, these facilities still require enormous amounts of constant 24-hour electricity. So in practice, what is often happening is that these companies are simultaneously buying up huge amounts of available renewable generation on paper, while utilities are still rapidly expanding fossil fuel infrastructure underneath just to meet the explosive growth in overall demand. So what gets presented publicly as green or carbon neutral is often sitting on top of a huge expansion of fossil fuel production. It's a little bit like what happened with the term organic in agriculture. It started as one thing, but over time its meaning was shifted quietly by corporate interests and agencies, and now it doesn't really mean what most consumers think it means. The branding creates a simplified public image that sounds cleaner and more sustainable than it actually is. The other thing people rarely talk about is heat. These facilities generate enormous amounts of it, and that heat has to go somewhere. Cooling is now one of the defining infrastructure challenges of the AI era. Depending on the design, a large-scale data center can consume hundreds of thousands to millions of gallons of water every day. That means withdrawals from municipal systems, rivers, reservoirs, aquifers. And again, this creates a very familiar industrial tension. The cheapest cooling methods are often the most water intensive. So communities need to ask, what happens during a drought? What happens during heat waves? What happens when residential demand collides with industrial demand? Because in many places, these projects are being fast-tracked so aggressively that communities are being caught completely flat-footed without modern regulations, long-term planning, or meaningful public understanding of what these facilities may require from their local water systems. We are already starting to see signs of these tensions emerging in some regions. In drought-prone areas, there have been growing conflicts where large data centers are being given preferential treatment for water while citizens are being told to conserve water. In some communities, residents on private wells are experiencing declining water pressure after data centers move in. And utilities in multiple states have warned that existing water infrastructure is being pushed towards its limits. But it's not just about water consumption, it's also about waste. Wastewater from data centers can contain treatment chemicals, corrosion inhibitors, heavy metals, and other industrial contaminants. Regulators and environmental groups in some regions have raised concerns about forever chemicals being tied to data center wastewater. And even with extensive cooling systems, large data centers can contribute to localized heat island effects. Some studies have identified measurable increases in ambient temperature in the microclimates surrounding large facilities. Then there's the air emissions. The diesel backup systems used by these facilities and the natural gas infrastructure needed to support hyperscale energy demands carries an entire industrial supply chain with it. all of which contributes to airborne particulate matter, greenhouse gases, VOC emissions, industrial traffic, and additional public health burdens. From our work on exposure, including interviews and collaborations with researchers like Dr. Nicole Diesel from Yale, we already know there are serious public health concerns associated with large fossil fuel and industrial infrastructure. Elevated risks tied to air pollution exposure, respiratory diseases, adverse pregnancy outcomes, and certain childhood cancers documented in communities living near heavy industrial activity. Hyperscale data centers dramatically intensify many of those same pressures, and the industry still is not speaking honestly enough about the scale of the potential impacts. At this point, it should be clear that despite AI and cloud computing being marketed as something abstract and digital, the physical footprint behind it is anything but for the people living next to the infrastructure that powers it. The benefits of these data centers may be narrated nationally by politicians, investors, tech companies, and talking heads. But the burdens of this build-out are intensely local, physical, and very real for the communities expected to host it. So what should people actually know if a data center is being proposed near them? First, communities need to understand how vulnerable they can be without strong zoning and land use protections already in place. A lot of rural municipalities either have no zoning at all or ordinances written decades ago for a completely different era of development. And that matters because hyperscale data centers, major energy infrastructure, and utility-scale industrial projects operate at a scale capable of fundamentally reshaping rural communities. Without strong zoning, local governments often have very limited leverage once projects are already underway. But with a modern zoning and land use framework, communities can exert meaningful control over how large industrial projects are built and operated. That can include where facilities are allowed, setbacks from homes and waterways, noise and lighting standards, water use protection, stormwater requirements, traffic controls, backup generation rules, emergency planning, and importantly, then this is really important, decommissioning obligations. Communities generally cannot simply ban otherwise lawful development outright. In Pennsylvania, exclusionary zoning creates major legal problems. You can't just say no data centers are allowed here. But municipalities absolutely can shape how projects operate. Timing matters. Far too often, local governments take a wait-and-see approach. But once developers have already begun outreach, municipalities can quickly find themselves reacting defensively instead of setting rules proactively. Waiting is also often the legally riskiest posture because once a company has already begun land acquisition and planning, formal applications and things like that, municipalities can face significant legal challenges if they attempt to impose new restrictions or substantially change the rules mid-process. That is why communities should push for ordinances before applications arrive. The other thing is residents should use public records laws. Ask for communications between developers, public officials, planning consultants, utilities, and economic development agencies. Reach out to nonprofits and get them to help you draft these requests so that you can make sure you get what you're asking for. And if responses appear incomplete, appeal them. Third, communities should stop framing these conversations simply as jobs versus no jobs. Ask how many permanent jobs are actually being created, who pays for infrastructure upgrades, how much public revenue is being given away through tax abatements and other incentives, what happens to ratepayers, water systems, or neighboring property values, what happens when the company goes bankrupt or decides to sell, or the project is done. Because one of the most common patterns across extractive industries is the externalization of costs. Road damage, grid upgrades, water infrastructure strain, emergency response burdens, environmental remediation. Communities are promised growth while taxpayers quietly absorb long-term indirect costs. Finally, communities should insist on consent before commitment. Consent does not mean a 3-minute public comment period after decisions are already moving. Consent means the public can understand a proposal, can question it, can shape it, and reject it if the costs are too high. Because this scale of these projects means that they do not just affect the parcel that they land on. They affect the entire community and sometimes the entire region. It is not unreasonable to believe that the people expected to live with the consequences should have meaningful power in the decision-making process. Now, about the economics, because the money and the jobs, of course, are the big selling point of any large industrial project. And this is where the numbers start becoming really important. Amazon's data center buildout in Pennsylvania is a good example of the broader tension here. The company says it plans to invest roughly $20 billion in AI and cloud infrastructure across the state, while creating about 1,250 permanent direct jobs, according to the most recent report that I read. Now, to be fair, projects at this scale absolutely create temporary construction employment and some secondary economic activity. But communities need to look carefully at the ratio between investment and long-term jobs. Investing $20 billion for roughly 1,200 permanent jobs, that is a staggering amount of industrial infrastructure, energy demand, land use, and public impact for a relatively tiny overall workforce. During the construction phase, there will no doubt be a lot of jobs created, and that's not nothing. But it is temporary, and on highly specialized industrial projects like these, a significant portion of the construction workforce can come from out of state. We saw this repeatedly during the fracking boom.
But the fact is that, we've seen now for 20 years, more than 20 years, they've been fracking in Pennsylvania, and we've seen that the job numbers never live up to the hype. Never, not even close. And so, we're talking about communities that will really end up paying far more than they will ever reap. And that's one of the things that we do try to talk about.
Where many of the jobs being celebrated politically were filled by transient workers from places like Texas and Oklahoma. And that matters because transient out-of-state workforces don't contribute to local economies in the same way that long-term local employment does. During the fracking boom, politicians frequently highlighted total job numbers without distinguishing between permanent local employment and temporary specialized workers brought in from other states. Then, once construction slows down or the project is completed, many of those workers leave, and that creates the classic boom-bust cycle that many regions that have dealt with extractive industries know well. A short burst of economic activity followed by sharp contractions that can leave small communities economically unstable and heavily dependent on the next wave of industrial development. Despite all of that nuance, and despite the surprisingly small long-term employment numbers relative to the sheer scale of capital and infrastructure, political leaders still present these projects as though communities should be astonished by the job creation. Then there's the issue of investment. Politicians and corporate leaders love to say a company is investing X amount of billions of dollars into the state or the region. But let's be real about what that actually means. That money is primarily being spent on infrastructure the company itself owns and controls for its own operation. It's not the same thing as a direct investment into local schools and hospitals and roads and public infrastructure. I'm a fine woodworker by trade, outside of what I do here. If I buy a $5,000 table saw for my shop, technically that's an investment. But it would be strange for me to market that as a major investment in my community, right? Politicians and corporations blur that distinction constantly. When an asset benefits the company or burdens you and me, it is treated like a private asset, completely under corporate control. But when they want tax breaks or subsidies or political goodwill or public support, suddenly that same private corporate asset gets rhetorically reframed as an investment in the community or the state. And speaking of tax breaks, when officials talk about how much future tax revenue these projects may generate, they're often talking about the gross potential revenue before subsidies, abatements, exemptions, and incentive packages dramatically reduce the actual public return. Many of these developments receive major public incentives: long-term property tax abatements, sales tax exemptions on equipment purchases. We're seeing that a lot in data centers. Utility discounts, infrastructure assistance, and other incentive packages designed to attract the project in the first place. And this brings me to something that has bothered me for years. I think we desperately need to rethink how we evaluate economics and development in this country, because we are constantly mesmerized by gross economic activity while paying far less attention to net public benefit. Gross investment, gross construction spending, gross domestic product, all headline numbers. But gross activity only tells a small part of the story. What stays in the community? What actually improves long-term quality of life? What of that value remains after subsidies and abatements and infrastructure costs and environmental burden and public health impacts and long-term public risks are accounted for? Because cleanup costs, environmental liabilities, infrastructure strain, public health consequences are all part of the economic ledger too, that we routinely just ignore. GDP measures activity. It does not meaningfully distinguish between activity that improves people's lives and activity that simply generates transactions. Cleanup after a chemical spill contributes to GDP. War contributes to GDP. Massive healthcare spending contributes to GDP. GDP measures motion, not wellness. And that same problem shows up consistently in how industrial projects are marketed. Officials talk about billions in investment, billions of future tax revenue and economic growth, but communities need to ask a much more precise question. What is the actual net public benefit after all the subsidies and abatements and exemptions and infrastructure incentives and utility discounts and long-term externalized costs are stripped out? Because $1 billion facility can sound transformative in a press release, but if the long-term employment footprint is relatively small while the public absorbs hidden costs and long-term liabilities, then how transformative is it really? And this is where I think our entire system of economic accounting starts breaking down. Because short-term gross activity can hide enormous long-term debt. Right now, just outside of Pittsburgh, taxpayers are still paying to clean up a radioactive contamination tied to old nuclear fuel processing operations that began in the 1950s around Apollo and Parks Township. Back then, those facilities were marketed as jobs, investment, development, national progress tied to the Cold War economy. But decades later, contaminated soils, buried radioactive waste, polluted disposal areas, and long-term remediation projects have left the federal government, meaning taxpayers, you and me, on the hook for cleanup costs now estimated to be upwards of $1 billion. We see similar patterns with oil and gas. Pennsylvania is estimated to have well over 100,000 abandoned gas wells. Many leak methane and VOCs, contaminate soil and water. They create long-term public safety and environmental hazards. And the cost of locating, monitoring, plugging, and remediating those wells is increasingly falling onto taxpayers through state and federal cleanup programs that are expected to require billions of additional dollars over time. That is exactly what I mean by externalized costs. At the time, those industries were marketed as economic growth. At the time, concerned citizens were dismissed. At the time, communities were told everything was above board, safe, and everything was compliant. We were sold on jobs, investment, development, national progress. But if a project generates economic activity today and then leaves behind massive public costs 30 years from now, that is not real growth, that is debt. It is wealth extraction in the short term, followed by cost externalization in the long term. The profit gets privatized while the liabilities get deferred into the future and eventually handed to taxpayers, future generations, and communities that had very little say in the original decision. And I think that is the bigger story here, because data centers are simply the next most urgent iteration of this broken record. Once you start accounting for the full picture and you start seeing how much of this debt actually exists, many of these projects begin looking far less like sustainable prosperity and growth and much more like liability, extraction, and exploitation. At a certain point, all of these threads start collapsing into the same conversation. The playbook, the extraction model, the economic problems, the resource depletion, the erosion of democratic trust. Because ultimately, this is not just a story about data centers. It's a story about power. About who holds it, who benefits from it, who absorbs the cost of it, and what happens when technologies become powerful enough to permanently entrench existing systems of wealth and institutional control. That is what makes this moment feel different and particularly dystopian. Not just the scale of the infrastructure, not just the energy demand, not just the convoluted economics, but the possibility that AI becomes the mechanism through which many of these systems become harder and harder to challenge, regulate, escape, or even fully see. Because this infrastructure is not just powering software, as we've covered. It is powering systems that increasingly mediate how people work, communicate, learn, create, consume information, interact with institutions, and understand reality itself. Mass surveillance, behavioral prediction, algorithmic persuasion, automated decision systems, AI-driven labor displacement, synthetic media, institutional control over information flows, and even artificial relationships. And much of this is being built around extremely centralized infrastructure controlled by governments, hyperscale corporations, military contractors, intelligence systems, and massive concentrations of capital. I think that is why public anxiety around AI feels different from previous technologies, because many people instinctively sense this is not just another consumer platform or gadget. It is infrastructure capable of reshaping the balance of power inside society itself. And when you connect that reality back to everything we've talked about throughout this episode, the land use and the water demand and the energy and the subsidies and the democratic imbalance and the externalized costs, the deeper concern starts becoming much harder to ignore, because we are not simply being asked to absorb massive physical and economic burdens in exchange for some abstract future of technological benefit. That part's not new. Appalachia and countless other regions have already lived through versions of that story for generations. What feels different here is that all of this sacrifice is ultimately leading to something else. We are being asked to reorganize landscapes, energy systems, water systems, and even democratic processes around feeding and expanding this machinery. Not around feeding people, not around improving public health, not around strengthening education or helping communities thrive, but around building and sustaining systems that many people increasingly fear could eventually displace human labor, weaken human agency, mediate human relationships, and concentrate even more power into already dominant institutions. That is the deeper issue underneath all this. History shows us that human beings are far less disciplined, thoughtful, and wise with technology than we like to imagine. We tend to optimize for convenience, speed, profit, and stimulation long before we seriously reckon with long-term consequences. We become dependent on the shortcut. We normalize excess. We race towards the lowest common denominator. And far too often, we fall short of the more thoughtful, human-centered potential that technology may have originally promised. And it's there. That promise is in there. But we just aren't going for it. We saw this with fossil fuels, with plastics, with industrial agriculture, with television, with social media. That is the real concern. Not technology itself, but humanity's repeated tendency to pursue forms of progress that concentrate power and externalize cost and weaken democracy and accountability. And then we frame those arrangements as inevitable or morally unquestionable. If there was ever a moment for society to slow down and seriously ask where all this is leading, it is probably now. So all of this brings us to something I've been wrestling with for a few weeks now. I keep coming back to this question. Why are people reacting so intensely to data centers specifically? Because if we're being honest, living next to a massive petrochemical facility or natural gas processing plant is probably on the whole worse for your immediate health than living next to a data center. So why does this issue feel so different for people? And yes, part of it is everything we've just talked about. It's the water, it's the energy demand, it's the economics and the extraction model and the democratic concerns. But I think it is also something deeper. I'm old enough to remember life before smartphones, social media, and constant digital integration. And while some of that technology genuinely improved life and is fun and builds efficiency into work and all of that, much of it has also become addictive, invasive, alienating, and psychologically corrosive. Algorithms shaping culture, social media affecting mental health, automated systems replacing human interactions, and the manipulation of politics. This is a world where opting out has become increasingly difficult every year, and almost none of it arrived through any meaningful democratic process. It just arrived and became so dominant in society that it became difficult to live and work without it. So I think part of what people are reacting to is not just the land use and the electricity demand. The data center has become symbolic. It is the physical embodiment of a future that increasingly feels imposed on society rather than collectively chosen. A future where more and more of human life is mediated by machines and automation and algorithm and viewed through the lens of efficiency and systems that ordinary people feel increasingly powerless to influence. And I think the data center is one of the first moments where many people are finally able to physically see and emotionally connect to the infrastructure behind that future. For a long time, digital life felt abstract, and its physical footprint was invisible. But now it's not. The land clearing, the substations, the power plants, the water demands, the massive industrial campuses. And for the first time, many people are able to say, you know what, I don't think I like where this is headed. And if you're asking for my consent, my answer is no. Are we moving too fast as a society in an uncertain direction? Are we concentrating too much power? Are we once again failing to seriously interrogate the long-term consequences of what we are building before it becomes deeply embedded into everyday life? And no matter how many Silicon Valley tech giants deflect and dismiss, those are not irrational questions. A healthy democratic society should not be hostile towards people asking difficult questions about projects capable of reshaping entire regions and potentially society itself. That skepticism is not obstruction. It is not anti-technology. It is not anti-American or anti-capitalism or pro-China. It is completely normal, sane, and reasonable to be skeptical of all of this and to be asking all those questions and more. When a society becomes so obsessed with growth, speed, competition, and technological escalation that even basic concerns about democracy, public health, water, human well-being, or long-term consequences are treated like obstacles to bypass, then something has gone profoundly wrong with its moral priorities. Now, to be fair and clear, there's no realistic version of modern society that operates without data centers. This is not just AI. Every time you send a text message, make an online purchase, upload a video, access your bank account, stream a movie, trade a stock, move goods through global supply chain, data centers are involved somewhere in that process. Hospitals rely on them, emergency communication systems rely on them, modern logistics, weather, forecasting, navigation, utilities. So this is not a conversation necessarily about whether digital infrastructure should exist at all. But I think this ultimately comes down to two larger conversations society desperately needs to have. The first is about limits. How much of human life actually needs to be digitized? Is there a version of society where we become more disciplined and intentional about our digital footprint instead of endlessly expanding it without any thought? I feel like for the past 30 years, we've been swept up in the fantasy of digital life while increasingly ignoring the real world. And maybe it's time that we have a reckoning with that. Do we eventually need a broader cultural conversation about simplification and boundaries and whether every part of human existence truly benefits from being absorbed into digital systems? The second conversation is about governance and accountability. If some level of data center infrastructure is genuinely necessary, and it clearly is, then how do we build and regulate these systems in ways that are less extractive, less disruptive, less resource intensive, and more accountable to the communities expected to host them? How do we ensure democracy, civic participation, transparency, and public consent remain central to the process rather than treating those things like obstacles to bypass? And honestly, this could become an important opportunity. Maybe data centers become the moment the society is finally forced to rethink how industrial development operates more broadly. Because none of this is actually all that new. This manipulative, extractive model of development has existed for a very long time. Industries privatize profits, externalize costs, hollow out communities, and they leave the public holding the liabilities decades later. We should not be building an economy on that model. And so maybe this is an opportunity to look at that and reflect on it and reconcile it and fix it. That's it for today's exposure points. If this work matters to you, get involved, share these conversations, subscribe, or support us at exposurestudios.org. Every dollar helps us shine light where industry wants darkness, and every share expands our reach. You can also check out our long-form interviews on Exposure, where my co-host Jill Hunkler and I talk with experts, researchers, whistleblowers, and impacted community members. We're going to be continuing to follow the data center issue very closely because this is not a short-term story. The decisions being made right now around AI infrastructure, energy systems, water use, land development, and democratic control are going to shape communities and public policy for decades. These industries have built a model of offloading their costs onto the public, our health, our water, our land, our tax base, and often our democratic power itself. With your help, we'll keep investigating those systems and holding them accountable. I'm Stuart Day. This is Exposure Points, and I'll see you next time.